Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. World War II took place in essentially two venues. There was the European theater, which is, fighting the Nazis. The European theater also typically includes North Africa, but also the Pacific theater, where the Allies take on the other end of the tripartite agreement, the other end of the Axis powers, that of Japan, which is our episode 5, The War in Pacific. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to identify key turning points in the war in the Pacific. You should be able to outline the offensive movements of Americans in the Pacific. You should be able to explain the development of the atomic bomb and offer debates about its use. And you should be able to describe the challenges faced by the Allies in building a lasting peace. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 13. While the Allies had essentially wrapped up the war in Europe by defeating the Nazis and squashing the German aggression, that was their first priority. The United States did not wait until VE Day, until there was victory in Europe, to go move against Japan. Fortunately, the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor of 1941 had missed the Pacific Fleet's submarines. While it did cripple much of the U.S. Navy, it did miss the submarines. But even more importantly, the attack had missed the fleet's aircraft carriers, which were out at sea at the time and not in a particular place. Subpoint B. During the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had really moved fast in the Atlantic to go conquer an empire which would have dwarfed Hitler's Third Reich, just in terms of the total amount of land. It was an enormous amount. Of the Asian mainland, Japanese troops overran Hong Kong and French Indochina and Malaya and Burma and Thailand, and much of the country of China was all now part of the Japanese Empire. They also swept south and east across the Pacific, conquering the Dutch East Indies and Guam and Wake Island and the Solomon Islands and countless other outposts in the ocean, including 2 islands even in the Aleutian chain, which were part of Alaska. In the Philippines, there was 80,000 American and Filipino troops who were battling the Japanese for control of that archipelago of islands. At the time of the Japanese invasion of December of 1941, General Douglas MacArthur at this point had been placed in command of Allied forces on the islands. When American and Filipino forces found themselves with their backs to the wall on Bataan, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave, basically saying, there's no reason to keep American soldiers here and dying in the Philippines. We got to get you out of there. On March 11th of 1942, MacArthur left the Philippines with his wife and his son and his staff, and as he turned, he pledged to the many thousands of men who did not make it out famous words, well remembered, "I shall return." It was a promise that MacArthur intended to keep. Subpoint C. In the spring of 1942, the Allies began to turn the tide against the Japanese. On April 18th, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 bombers across a daring attack on Tokyo. Pulling off a Pearl Harbor-style air raid over Japan did a lot to raise America's sunken spirits. At the same time, it also dampened the spirits in Japan, and it felt like, while this wasn't, turning the tide of the war, it did show Americans could go win a skirmish here and there. Subpoint D. Here I want to talk about the Battle of the Coral Sea. The main Allied forces in the Pacific were the Americans and the Australians, who I don't think get enough credit for their work in World War II. In May of 1942, they succeeded in stopping the Japanese drive towards Australia in the Battle of the Coral Sea. During this battle, the fighting was done by airplanes launched from enormous aircraft carriers. Not a single shot was fired from surface ships. This was all aerial combat fired by airplanes. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, a Japanese invasion had been stopped and even turned back. Subpoint E. Japan's next thrust, though, was towards Midway, a strategic island that lies northwest of Hawaii. There, the Allies succeeded in stopping the Japanese. The Americans had broken the Japanese codes, the ciphers, and they knew that Midway was to be their next target. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was the commander of the American naval forces in the Pacific, he moved to go defend this island of Midway. On June 3rd of 1942, his scout planes found the Japanese fleet. The Americans then sent torpedo planes and dive bombers into the attack. The Japanese were caught with the planes still on the decks of their aircraft carriers. The results were devastating for the Japanese. By the end of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese had lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, and 250 planes. In the words of a Japanese official, at Midway, the Americans had avenged Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway was an important turning point in the war, where turning points are really these great pieces in your study of history, where it appears the course of history is moving one direction, and then something alters it, whether it's a total turnaround or just a slight alter in the path. But a turning point is where you begin to see the future of history taking a new shape. And the Battle of Midway is definitely one of those. After that, the Allies began a strategy of World War II known as island hopping, where they would go capture certain islands back from the Japanese, but leave others entirely untouched as they won territory, pieces along the way. Sometimes they might even leave what are important islands, just skip over them and hop to a new one that wasn't defended as well. This island hopping approach was how the American forces really tried to neutralize the Japanese presence in the Pacific. Roman numeral number 14. Here I want to talk about how the shift moves from a defensive war to an offensive war in the Pacific. And the first discussion here will be of subpoint A of Guadalcanal. The first Allied offensive began in August of 1942, when 19,000 troops stormed Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. By the time the Japanese abandoned Guadalcanal 6 months later, they called it the Island of Death. Guadalcanal marked Japan's first defeat on land, but not its last. Americans continued moving across the Pacific towards Japan. In October of 1944, around 178,000 Allied troops and 738 ships were converging on Leyte Island in the Philippines. General MacArthur, who had left the Philippines 2 years earlier, now returning to the islands which he had fought before, he waded ashore and announced, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." It was a promise he did intend to keep. Subpoint B. The Japanese sent their entire fleet into the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They also tested a new tactic, and one that would really characterize the public imagination of how the Japanese would fight. It's the kamikaze, or a suicide plane, an attack in which Japanese pilots would fight as long as they could and then crash bomb-laden planes into the side of Allied ships, basically shooting as long as they can and then turning their entire plane into a suicide death missile. Kamikaze is a Japanese term. It means the divine wind, and it refers to a legendary typhoon that saved Japan in the year 1281 by destroying a Mongol invasion. In the Philippines, 424 kamikaze pilots embarked on suicide missions, sinking 16 ships and damaging another 80. Despite the kamikazes, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a disaster for Japan. In 3 days of battle, they lost 3 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and almost 500 airplanes. From then on, the Japanese Imperial Navy really only played a minor role in the battles and fighting of World War II. Subpoint C. After retaking much of the Philippines and liberating American prisoners of war, the Allies turned to Iwo Jima. And Iwo Jima is an island that an American writer later described as an ugly, smelly glob of cold lava squatting in a surly ocean. If Iwo Jima doesn't sound real pretty, I think that's how people felt about it. It actually means Sulphur Island in Japan. It's basically a volcanic island with bad soil, and it's awful. But it was critical to the United States as a base from which they could launch heavily loaded bomber planes that might actually reach Japan. It was also perhaps the most heavily defended spot on Earth, with 20,700 Japanese troops entrenched on the island. Iwo Jima has a lot of natural caves to it, so a lot of easy places to hide, and this was an important island that intended to be defended in the tunnels and caves of the island. More than 6,000 Marines were killed, U.S. Marines were killed trying to take this desolate island, the greatest number in any battle of the Pacific up to that point. And it was, oh man, of the 20,700 troops, Japanese troops that were there, by the time the Americans finished taking this island, there was 200 surviving Japanese soldiers. But it was a successful offensive, and just one obstacle stood now between the Allies and a final assault on the Japanese islands themselves, the island of Okinawa. Subpoint D. In April of 1945, U.S. Marines invaded Okinawa. The Japanese unleashed more than 1,900 kamikaze attacks on the Allies during this Okinawa campaign. They were successful at sinking 30 American ships, damaging 300 more, and killing almost 5,000 sailors. Once ashore, the Allies faced even fiercer opposition than they faced in Iwo Jima. By the time the fighting ended on June 21st of 1945, more than 7,600 Americans had died. But the Japanese paid an even ghastlier price, with 110,000 people killed in Okinawa defending that island. That included 2 generals who chose ritual suicide over the shame of surrender. The battle for Okinawa was a chilling foretaste of what the Allies imagined the invasion of Japan's home islands would be. If this is what Japan was going to do to defend Iwo Jima and Okinawa, what would they do on the 4 big islands that actually make up Japan? Churchill predicted that the cost of it could easily cost 1 million American lives and 500,000 British lives. Subpoint E. Douglas MacArthur, as the leader of basically the Pacific Campaign. Eisenhower in Europe is MacArthur in the Pacific. He was really kind of an arrogant guy and a very prickly guy. There's no way that anybody serving under MacArthur would ever think he was just a regular dude by his troops. But he was arguably the most brilliant Allied strategist of all of World War II. And the illustration of this is that for every American soldier killed in his campaigns, the Japanese lost 10 soldiers. He was considered a real hero of the war, both by the military and by the prisoners on the Philippines whom he freed. Roman numeral number 15. Taking Iwo Jima and Okinawa opened up a way for an invasion of Japan. But Allied leaders knew that the cost of such an invasion, not only just in financial cost, but in human cost, would be incredible, and it would really be a desperate struggle for victory. Japan still had a huge army that would defend every inch of their homeland and had sworn promises to their emperor, whom they considered divine, to defend to the last man, to the last gasp of life. President Truman really saw only one way to avoid an awful invasion of Japan, a powerful new weapon developed by the Manhattan Project, and that's the atomic bomb. Led by General Leslie Groves, with research directed by American scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the development of the atomic bomb was the most ambitious scientific enterprise in history, but it was also the best kept secret of the war. At its peak, around 600,000 Americans were involved in the Manhattan Project. Although very few people know the whole purpose, they might have known the task they were working on, but not the big picture of it. Even Truman didn't know about it until he became president. It was such a carefully guarded secret that the second most important person in America didn't know about it. The first test of the new bomb took place in the morning of July 16, 1945, in an empty expanse of desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico. A blinding flash, visible 180 miles away, was followed by a deafening roar as a tremendous shockwave rolled across the desert. President Truman now faced an important decision. Should he order the Allies to use the bomb to bring an end to war? Truman didn't hesitate. On July 25th, 1945, he ordered the military to make final plans for dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japanese targets. One day later, the United States warned Japan that it faced prompt and utter destruction unless it surrendered at once. Japan didn't surrender. Truman later wrote, "The final decision of where and when to use the atomic bomb was up to me." He writes further, "Let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used." Subpoint B. On August 6th, the B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay released an atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, over Hiroshima. Hiroshima is an important Japanese military center. 43 seconds later, almost every building in the city had collapsed into dust from the force of the blast. Hiroshima had ceased to exist. An entire city alive 1 minute and dead the next. Still, Japan's leaders hesitated to surrender. So 3 days later, a second bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped in Nagasaki. That leveled half of that city also. By the end of the year, an estimated 200,000, a fifth of a million people, had died as a result of injuries and radiation poisoning caused by the atomic blasts. Emperor Hirohito was horrified by the destruction wrought by the bomb. He says, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." He ordered them to draw up papers to end the war. On September 2nd, formal surrender ceremonies took place on the USS battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Roman numeral 16. Now, here I want to talk about the rebuilding process. What's it take to go rebuild the world after this destructive war? Subpoint A. Let's turn back to Europe. Besides geographic division, Germany had another price to pay for its part in the war. The discovery of Hitler's death camps led the Allies to put 24 surviving Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity and for crimes against peace and war crimes. The trials were held in a southern German town known as Nuremberg. At the Nuremberg trials, the defendants included Hitler's most trusted party officials, government ministers, and military leaders, and powerful industrialists who made it all possible. In the end, 12 of the 24 defendants were sentenced to death, and most of the remaining were sent to prison. In later trials of lesser leaders, nearly 200 more Nazis were found guilty of war crimes. Still, others have argued that the trials, these Nuremberg trials, didn't go far enough in seeking out and punishing war criminals. Many Nazis who took part in the Holocaust ended up walking free. Now, a little bit of this, I think, is a function of the legal procedures that existed. There really was no mechanism for crimes against humanity, and war crimes, crimes against peace, poorly understood. There was not actually much of a legal system which could even try people, but it just felt like such a huge injustice that something had to be done. Yet, no matter how imperfect the trials may have been, they did establish an important principle, that individuals are responsible for their own actions, even in times of war. Nazi executioners couldn't escape punishment by claiming that they were merely following orders. The principle of individual responsibility was now firmly entrenched in international law. If a person this is true today, by the way, if a person gives you an order that's immoral, you have no responsibility to obey that order. In fact, your conscience requires you to disobey it. The consequences of disobeying an order are never worth the immorality of doing something that's actually wrong, no matter who orders you to do it. Subpoint B. In Japan, the occupation of Japan and the undoing of the war there took an entirely different approach. Japan was occupied by U.S. forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. In the early years of the occupation, more than 1,100 Japanese people, former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, all the way down to lowly prison guards, were arrested and put on trial. 7 of them, including Tojo, were even sentenced to death. In the Philippines, in China, and other Asian battlegrounds, additional Japanese officials were tried for atrocities against civilians or prisoners of war. During the 7-year American occupation, MacArthur reshaped Japan's entire economy by introducing American-style free market practices. And it actually led to this huge Japanese resurgence in their economy and a remarkable economic recovery. MacArthur also worked to transform Japan's government. He called for a new constitution to be drafted, which would provide for women's rights to vote and a guarantee of basic freedoms. In the United States, Americans reported these changes with interest. The New York Times reported that General MacArthur has swept away an autocratic regime by a warrior god and installed in its place a democratic government over a very human emperor based on the will of the people as expressed in free elections. The Japanese government cribs large sections out of the American government, and it feels very much like an American constitution, and the Japanese apparently agreed. To this day, their constitution is referred to as the MacArthur Constitution. The question of what's the future going to hold, how will the United States deal with a rebuilt Europe and a re-understanding of how the Pacific and the Asian world should be, is a fascinating story, which is going to break out in 100 different ways, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.